So there's a tree that grows in the California desert that, if you think about it, it's kind of weird. It kind of has no business being there. And it stands about 60 feet tall. It can live more than 100 years, and every fall it drops clusters of fruit so sweet that Arab poets called it the milk of old men. Hi guys, this is Kraska. I move between architecture, material science, environmental engineering, culture, and history. And I have a soft spot for languages, and I think I'm a decent philosopher. And this is really a space for me to share these dots I've been connecting through my years of reading between cinema, cities, agriculture, food politics, and the forces that shape our world. So please subscribe, support, and enjoy. It is, of course, the date palm, the Phoenix dactylifera. Sorry. And if you drive through the Coachella Valley today, past the golf courses and the resort spas and the billion-dollar music festival that borrowed the valley's name, you will see them everywhere, row after row. And it's this Arabian silhouette against a Californian sky. And most people who see them don't question their presence because the palm has become so natural to this landscape. It feels like it has always belonged there. Like the earth just decided to grow it there. But the date palm is not native to the Americas, not to California certainly, and not to what the boosters once called America's Arabia. So how did it get there? So the answer required looking through multiple points in history through a Syrian camel driver named Hajali. He was a Confederate secretary for and wanted to import camels to kind of aid with the colonizing of the desert, as well as USDA botanists traveling through Ottoman port cities with stolen palm shoots in their luggage, and a biblical story that settlers wanted to believe applied to themselves when it didn't. The story that the desert was empty, that it was a wasteland, that it was waiting for them to make it bloom. So when settlers moved into the arid Southwest after the Mexican American War, they did not know what to do with what they found. The land did not look like the temperate farms and forests that they had left behind in the East. It was dry, it was hot, it was definitely unfamiliar, and crucially, already inhabited by people who had been farming it for centuries. So they reached for one of the only frameworks they had, which was the Bible. And 19th century American travel writers, scientists, and government officials began describing the arid West as a local version of Middle Eastern and North African desert, an American Sahara or a biblical Orient, one that carried spiritual and physical power equal to the old world deserts that populated the Judeo Christian imaginations of the settlers. And this was more important than it sounds like because if the American desert was the biblical desert, then colonization can then be framed as can be reframed as a pilgrimage, an act of sacred return rather than violent seizure, right? So as Koch writes, by directly linking to the familiar versions of the Middle Eastern deserts that fill the Bible, the American deserts could start to feel more familiar too. And Koch's Arid Empire was really the backbone of today's essay. So please do read that book for more information. The parts about the date palm only make up a few sections in that book. And it's really a very interesting and beautifully written um, research into the Southwest and how it was reframed through history. So the booster literature of the time leaned hard into this. The Colorado River Basin was endlessly called the American Nile. A 1910 railway brochure promised settlers that the desert was not a desert at all, just a dormant paradise awaiting for the right people to wake it up. Um, so you see how uninnocent this marketing is. It was what Catherine Gersdorf argues was a way to deactivate the existential anxieties of the pioneers and to alleviate some of their visceral reactions to the American West's aridity by recasting it as a quasi-oriental space containing yet unidentified but extremely valuable historical and cultural riches. So, at the center of this fantasy, one of the most powerful visual shorthands for this transformation of wasteland to paradise was the date palm. The U.S. Department of Agriculture had been founded in 1862, and by the 1890s, its agents were fanning out across the globe looking for crops that could make the American desert profitable. Two of the most vocal proponents of the date palm were Walter Swingle and David Fairchild, agricultural explorers who wrote entire books about dates. And they knew that date palms could not simply be grown from seed. Trees grown from seed could produce radically different fruit from their parent or none at all. So the USDA had to import suckers, which are apparently offshoots that grow at the base of a mature tree directly from the Middle East and North Africa. Transporting them alive was this months long ordeal by boat and rail, and it required constant watering and care, of course. So, between the 1890s and the 1910s, these palm offshoots were traveling from Ottoman Iraq, from French Algeria, and from Egyptian and Omani plantations to the brand new agricultural experiment stations of the American Southwest. The University of Arizona's first date palms were planted in Tempe in the 1890s. The Scientific American reported in 1899 it is now proposed by our Commissioner of Agriculture at Washington to make the date a staple American product also. The center of this new enterprise is to be the now useless desert regions of Southern California and Arizona. Useless is a word that erases thousands of years of indigenous agriculture in exactly those same river valleys. And by 1910, newspapers were already congratulating the University of Arizona's Agricultural Experiment Station director, Robert Forbes, for proving that even the choicest of the old world varieties of dates may be produced to perfection in Arizona. The date palm, as Koch writes, was a veritable icon of the settlers' ingenious civilization of the American Southwest through Old World agricultural imports. But notice the framing. The Old World did not mean Europe, it meant the biblical Orient, what is today the Middle East, the very people the settlers were simultaneously racializing as backwards and extracting botanical wealth from. So, the Arizona Agricultural Experiment Station's earliest directors, James Turney and Robert Forbes, built their careers on the date farm. They made the university a leader in arid lands expertise, a phrase that would prove to be the single most valuable commodity in the creation of what Koch calls Arid Empire. Frida Knobloch reminds us colonization is an agricultural act. There is a people the history books barely mention when they tell the story of the American date palm. The Akimel Oa Dam, sometimes called the Pima, had been farming the Gila River Valley for well over 1,000 years when the first settlers arrived. They built an elaborate system of irrigation canals that transformed the desert into a productive farmland. And they grew corn, beans, squash, cotton, and even their own varieties of native plants. But as the settlers moved in and began diverting the Gila River upstream for their own date palm and alfalfa and citrus, the water stopped reaching these Dam fields. And the historian David H. D. Chong has documented how between 1900 and 1915, the Pima were systematically deprived of water. So the U.S. Indian Irrigation Service surveyed the reservation in 1914 and mapped the damage, and farms abandoned little by little after that point. Villages were relocated, an entire agricultural civilization was forced to scale back, and the Pima shifted from water intensive crops to less intensive small grains, which was really a desperate survival based adaptation. This was not collateral damage, it was the logic of what Traci Bryan Voyles calls wastelanding, the process by which settler colonialism renders indigenous lands barren in the colonial imagination so that their actual life and productivity can be obscured and their people can be dispossessed. And the very same water that was diverted to grow date palms for the settlers was water that had sustained O'odham agriculture for generations. So the date palm wasn't just a crop, it really served as an alibi for taking this water from this agricultural civilization. And this is kind of like the real story inside the date palms migration, if you can call it that. The Making the Desert Bloom narrative was never just about horticulture, it was about law and property and who gets to decide what land is worth. Um, the legal scholar Sarah Krakow has argued that in the US context, American Indian law has often done the work of just clearing the land, while natural resources law assures the successful occupation of that land by the non indigenous. The date palm was a prop in that story. Its presence on the land was presented as proof that the settlers had improved the desert, while the farms of the Akime O'o Dam, which had been there for centuries, simply did not count as agriculture at all. The desert, as Koch puts it, can be imagined as a blank state laboratory for testing out the ideas and crops of the old world or a wasteland that can be made to bloom through the wonders of modern science. But this is a uniquely depoliticizing image because it directs our attention to the productive crops and planted by the settlers rather than the processes of colonization and land dispossession. By the 1920s, the date industry had largely migrated from Arizona to California's Coachella Valley, where it concentrated and thrived. And with the date palms came an entire fantasy. The annual Riverside County Date Festival, launched in 1921, wasn't simply this harvest festival in any conventional sense. It was this full blown Orientalist pageant. The fairgrounds were built in what promoters called Arabian architecture, domes, minarets, arch. There was an Arabian Nights music pageant. Um, there were also camel races, sheikh costumes, and harem girl costumes. And Americans dressed up as the people whose botanical knowledge and agricultural labor made the date palm possible, while simultaneously erasing the fact that these people were still alive, still there, still present, and still being occupied by some Western powers in those very same decades at the time. In her dissertation, America's Arabia, the historian Sarah Seekatz argues that these racial masquerades mirror larger American practices around blackface and playing Indian, and yeah, though few questioned the custom. The act of playing Arab Shiites uncovers the importance of the date and its Orientalist connotations for the region's tourism and internal community. So Coachella Valley growers marketed their dates through this kind of Orientalist romance, but with a twist, they also highlighted dirt, disease, and unsanitary conditions of foreign date packing, they claimed, while emphasizing that the power of American science and modernity, and particularly pasteurization and fumigation. So, this is the double move that Edward Said later described as the core of Orientalism. The East is romanticized as exotic and ancient, but simultaneously denigrated as dirty, backward, and in need of Western improvement. The date was sold as a taste of Arabian exoticism, but also as proof that American science has improved it, that the palm had been rescued from the people who had cultivated it for a millennia. And that behavior to extract the plant, romanticize its origins, denigrate its original growers, and rebrand the whole operation as a triumph of Western science is at the heart of what Koch calls Arid Empire. There is one fact the date palms boosters never put in the brochures. A single date palm requires somewhere between 64 and 83 inches of water per year to produce commercial grade fruit. To put that into perspective, the Coachella Valley receives about 3 inches of rain annually. So that water does not come from the sky. It has to come from the Colorado River, pump through the canals and pipelines and aqueducts and some of the most expensive and energy intensive water infrastructure on this entire planet. It comes from the same river that the United States fought legal battles over for the entirety of the 20th century. It comes from the same river that was dammed and diverted upstream, eventually drying up the delta so completely that for decades the Colorado River stopped reaching the sea. In 2021, as the Colorado River Basin entered its 22nd year of drought, the federal government declared the first ever Tier 1 water shortage. Lake Mead had dropped to its lowest level since it was first filled in the 1930s. California's date industry, concentrated almost entirely in the Coachella and Part valleys, continued to receive its full allocation. And this is not an accident. This is, of course, a material legacy of a century of water law designed to serve this project, a project in which the improvement of land through agriculture was the legal and moral basis of for claiming ownership. The Winters Doctrine, established by the Supreme Court in 1908, recognized that tribes had reserved water rights on their reservations. But in practice, as the legal scholar Andrew Curley has shown, the proposed water settlements produced contradictory logics, forcing indigenous nations to litigate for generations to claim even a fraction of the water that had been taken from them. The water that grows Coachella's date palms is water that was taken from indigenous people, then legalized through a century of colonial water law. In 2018, the Omani government signed a $3.9 million deal with the University of Arizona to establish a date palm research laboratory outside Muscat. Here is the irony, though. The experts the Omanis hired were the University of Arizona's date palm scientists. Um, they're the direct intellectual descendants of the very USDA explorers who took palm offshoots from Oman and the surrounding region in the 1890s. So the knowledge that was extracted from the Middle East was then shipped to Arizona. It was systematized into arid lands expertise at the Agricultural Experiment Station and then packaged as an American scientific achievement and then sold back to the places where it originated as at a profit. As Koch writes, the University of Arizona's expertise in date palm agriculture that the Omani government purchased in 2018 came from Oman and its neighbors. To be clear and fair, this is not a simple story of theft. Koch is careful to say that it is too simplistic to say that the Arizonians stole the plant knowledge of the Omanis only to sell it back to them a century later. Rather, what this project did so effectively was to harness the idea of arid lands expertise and to package this into this burgeoning higher education system and the scientific establishment. The most valuable commodity in the creation of Arid Empire was not the date palm itself, it was this expertise that came with it, the ability to claim that American science had mastered the desert, that settlers had turned wasteland into garden, and that the University of Arizona was the world's authority on arid lands. This expertise was and is a form of value capture, a way of converting botanical knowledge dispossessed in indigenous land and exploited labor into institutional prestige and foreign contracts. The geographer Georges Traci makes a brief appearance in Koch's book. In the 1960s, he published a pair of photographs of the same location in Syria, taken decades apart. In the first, a camel crosses the frame. In the second, a Coca Cola truck does. Cressy called it the March to Progress. But Koch sees something else in that double exposure. It's a way to see across time and to see across space and think this is what the date palm kind of demands of us, the ability to see double, to see the tree and the water it drinks, to see the fruit and the hands that picked this fruit first, to see the beauty and the violence that made the beauty possible. The Arabian date palm in Coachella looks like it had always been there, and I think that's kind of the point. Now, this is a complex history, and it's much larger than the date palm. The date palm is just like one character in it, but I just want you to be aware, to be more mindful, and to think as you're consuming dates in the future about the Oo Dam farm, about water politics, and as you bite into your Majdoul date that's grown in California, that's shipped from an oasis in the desert, that's sweet as redemption, you can now see the history of Arid Empire in it. Thank you.